Welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview podcast. This is the episode we're going to handle Genesis 4. Mike, good to have you back. How have you been?
I've been good. Been recovering from some sort of weird virus that I caught a few weeks ago. So if my voice sounds a little hoarse, that's a little bit of the reason why.
And I had pink eye, so
oh dear.
You may not sound good. I don't look good. Together we'll be fine. We've had a mild winter out here in Minnesota. We got about an inch of snow the other day, and then, of course, it froze, and that caused havoc for a day. But we're back to a normal, well, not normal. This has been an abnormally mild winter, so we're extremely happy about that in Minnesota because it can be long. That's the problem out here is when snow falls, it stays for 4 months. So we had hardly anything up until last week, and now we have about an inch. But that's... I have no complaints on my side. So,
well, I have a lot of friends up in the Boston area with me who are always complaining because this winter and last winter has been abnormally warm. I think we've been hitting average temperatures of the 40s, which at this time of year, we're usually in the teens. And we have already had 3-4 nor'easters by now. We've had 2.
Oh, my.
And the last one just came this past Tuesday for us. And everyone was all panicking. They were doing their whole entire French toast run, which is basically bread, milk, and eggs. So you can make French toast. Yeah. And instead, on that Tuesday, when it came, it shifted and basically dumped a foot of snow on Plymouth and then dropped like an inch of snow in our area up near Boston. And then everything flash froze. So that was great. It was just pretty much like everything got washed off by rain. Snow came. Roads froze. Yeah. And so we all had to deal with the crazy on Wednesday.
Yeah. Well, we're going to jump into Genesis 4. We ended 3 last time. Again, our practice is to show the text on our screen as well. So if you, the listener, can look at the text, that'd be great. If you just want to listen, I hope that works as well. So we ended 3. And of course, there are a lot of questions that come out of Genesis 3. It's fascinating to me that it's one of the most famous stories of the Bible, obviously, but it's one of the most question fraught chapters in all the Bible as well. In other words, why this story? Why did God even go through this? Who is the snake? Did he lie? Did he tell the truth? Who did he want Adam and Eve to be like, God or gods? How did Eve fall if she hadn't fallen, right? Where did evil even come from in that story? Even was there a fall? And I'd like to talk that idea out just a little bit more. What did Adam and Eve realize when they ate? What was the problem or the curses that came from us? Who is the us in 3:22? All those questions I think we can move on, from, but just to admit that in a divine counsel worldview, there are some things that I think are required or, that come with the worldview. There are many things that can be optional or can be a discussion point within the worldview. And I always want to be open to that because the purpose of this podcast is not to study the text as a blank page, but as how would a person who wants to follow through on a divine counsel worldview handle the text verse by verse? And so the nervousness I have, of course, is mandating a view that's not mandatable, or that's just my personal view or your personal view, Mike. So the question of what to take out of a certain passage is always up for a little debate. So, in fact, that opening question that I do want to run back to, was there a what we call fall, and capital F usually in Christian theology? This is out of John Walton's book, The Lost World of Adam and Eve. It's chapter and I love Walton's works. I mean, again, what I ask a author to do is make me think, and boy, does he make me think. And the point of, again, an author is not to always agree with them, but to take you through operative questions and think well through them. And again, if you come out the other side with a different view, so be it, but at least you've thought through the question. And Proposition 15 in his book, again, The Lost World of Adam and Eve, by John Walton. The title of his chapter is Adam and Eve Chose to Make of Themselves the Center of Order and Source of Wisdom, thereby admitting disorder into the cosmos. Let me just read a few of his lines in this chapter. And again, I'm jumping around, so just to be fair. The fall was the decision to be like God, capital G. They were trying to be like God by positing themselves as the center and source of order. Again, jumping a little further, I'm on page 143 by now. In taking from the tree, Adam and Eve were trying to set themselves up as the satellite center of wisdom apart from God. It is a childish sort of response. I can do it by myself, or I want to do it my way. These are not a rejection of authority per se, but an insistence on independence. The act is an assertion that it's all about me, quote unquote, and it is one that has characterized humanity since the first act. With people as the source and center of wisdom, the result was not order centered on them, but disorder. Again, jumping ahead, we did not lose paradise as much as we forfeited sacred space and the relationship it offered, thereby damaging our ability to be in relationship with God and marring his creation with our own underdeveloped ability to bring order on our own in our own wisdom. In conclusion, Genesis 3 is more about the encroachment of disorder into a world in the process of being ordered than it is about the first sin. It is about how humanity lost access to the presence of God when its representatives tragically declared their independence from their creator. And that last line is a classic case of what we mean by the fall, right? That they are declaring their independence. And my point is that in reading this, how we frame the problem of Genesis 3 is largely going to frame the solution that we're going to look for in the rest of the Bible, right? The most, well, I'd say Western Christendom is based, and maybe even Judaism, is based on the idea of problem to solution. And the problem starts in Genesis 3, usually. And then the solution will be coming from that. And so my challenge to myself, and I offer it to you and our audience, is that as I even read Walton, I say to myself, really? I mean, coming out of Genesis 3, did they actually raise their fist and say, we're going to do it our way? Or could it be? And let me throw this open to you, Mike. For, again, what I appreciate about your presence with us is that I get to pose questions to you live like this, and I'm dropping them on you. We didn't prepare this, but does a divine counsel worldview require seeing a fall in Genesis 3? What do you think?
I think that we have to categorize, or we have to really define our terms for what we mean by fall, right? Because I think the classic way that I had understood the fall originally was that it was some sort of change, some sort of effect that had happened once they had eaten the fruit of knowledge. And that's something even down to maybe even the genetics or about the very nature of physical creation all of a sudden changed.
Right.
Because I remember there was a children's cartoon that was based on essentially like creating stories based off of the Old Testament, and it was like done in I think it was done by a Japanese studio, so it had like an anime kind of look to it. And I was a young kid, and I remember when they showed and portrayed the moment when Adam and his wife grabbed the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and then they ate it. And all of a sudden, storm clouds came, the wind blew, the sky turned from perfectly clear blue to just like dark and gloomy, and like thunder and lightning, like everything seemed like nature just transformed. And that was kind of the portrayal of what the fall was. And I don't think necessarily that a divine counsel worldview requires that perspective, but I do think it does help inform and maybe even challenge that kind of popular narrative.
Mm-hmm. Well, it certainly is the picture in our minds, growing up, that when they ate that fruit, everything, the skies got dark and thunderbolts clapped and all the rest. So for me, and this is where we got to keep moving forward, right, into Genesis 4, that if we come out of 3 with the question still, or starting to present the question of how was Adam and Eve's worship of Yahweh going? How was that doing?
Mm-hmm.
Then I think we're on the right path based on where the story will go. So I'll just throw it open to that idea, and I would love the listener to think about this, that as we get into Genesis 4, what if Adam and Eve are still righteous? They're still godly people. They certainly made a mistake. And in fact, to get to our text here, let's do this on our screen. Genesis 3:24. He drove out. 3:23 would be fine. Therefore, the Lord God sent him out of the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. Remember, the curse on Adam and Eve is to go back to the ground from which they were taken, which is a promise of death. And so that's the one thing we know for sure that they're going to endure is a death to come, that they'll turn into the dust from which they were made. And then 3:24 is basically what we know. He drove out the man at the east of the Garden of Eden. He placed the cherubim. These are these divine beings that seem to have a guardian role in the biblical record and even in the ancient Near East. These are not made up creatures in the Bible. Mm-hmm. Cherubim, of course, is the Hebrew word cherubim. We don't know how to translate it, so we just transliterate the Hebrew letters, and they do seem to show up later in the text and in the biblical text and throughout the ancient world as guardian beings to Yahweh as well as other divine beings. And a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. And Judaism does not miss that little preposition mm-hmm. to. They often do a midrash on this, in the sense of a midrash again means a spin or having fun with the text, and they see that word to may be an indication, if we look for it, that the story now centers on this coming back to the tree eventually. That's where we're going away from the tree here, but we're getting back to the tree somehow through the effect of our story to come. And I think that's a good point. So let's keep moving forward. And let's just jump into Genesis 4:1. Now, Adam knew his wife, Eve his wife, and of course, knowing here has the sense of having children, and she conceived and bore Cain. Doesn't say the first child they had, but presumably among the first children they had. Cain, saying, I have gotten a man. Of course, if you're able to watch the screen here, Cain, Cain, and gotten, kana, have a similar sound. So she's playing that word off, to get, kana. She's naming her first, or her, again, early born child, kana or Cain, a man from the help of Yahweh. And again, she bore his brother Hevel. That's that word in Ecclesiastes, wind, breath. And again, doesn't say it's the second born child, or it's even the first two kids, but among the first two children born apparently were Cain, and Hevel, Abel. Abel was a keeper of sheep and Cain a worker of the ground. Both are respectable, expected professions of that early period, and always have been in the ancient world, so we don't want to pick on them for what they do here. And verse 3, in the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering, a mincha. That word offering there is often, like in Leviticus 2, it is usually a fruit. It's not an animal. So the idea of Cain bringing an offering of fruit, the reader of 4:3 would not be nervous, saying, oh, why is he only bringing fruit? That's just an expected mincha, or offering that we're going to read about later, even within the Levitical rules. And Abel, as would be expected, when he brings his offering, he brings, because he's a sheep herder, a firstborn of his flock and of the fat portions. We don't know, again, where the command to sacrifice started, right? Again, I'm always amazed how much theology we pack in here. I was brought up on the idea that God taught them how to sacrifice and even taught them the requirement of it, and that here comes one of those offerings. Well, again, that's putting something in the text that's really not there. So my recommendation would be that we simply have an offering, and we're not told about who told them to do it, but we simply have an offering, and that so far nothing is wrong or They're not following rules as much as they're doing what the ancient world would often do when saying thank you or having a fellowship moment with their deity. They're simply bringing an offering. So the world at large, I think, was doing this at the time. Today, we fold our hands and close our eyes, right? And where do we learn that? Not from the Bible, but from our society. So I think much in the same way back in this day, they were simply bringing what their culture would have accepted as offerings to their deities. And notice where the story goes. Abel brought, end of 4:4. And the Lord had regard for Abel. I think that's important. That's why I put it in yellow, because the question is not the offering, I think, as much as the person. So even the text hints that it at issue was Yahweh's acceptance for Abel, and also his offering. And then 4:5, but for Cain and his offering, he had no regard. Cain was very angry, his face fell. There's a lot of texts that, in fact, let's do it now, right, Mike? Would that be okay? Let's talk about how Cain and Abel play out into the rest of the story of the Bible. Proverbs 15:8, the sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord, but the prayer of the upright is his delight. Proverbs 21:3, to do righteousness and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. 28:9, one who turns away his ear from hearing the law, even his prayer shall be an abomination. The reason I bring this up, and of course this is much later in the biblical story, is that there's a proverbial understanding within Israelite culture, and I would say within ancient culture, that a offering is not the issue as much as the heart of the person bringing the offering. I think that's just common sense. I think wives during our Valentine's Day, we just had Valentine's Day here, if you're not doing well with your spouse and you bring a gift, and it's a beautiful gift, it can cause heartache to the one who, to whom it's given, if that person doesn't have a good relationship, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's common sense, and I think bringing common sense to the text is a good thing. Here would be an example that in Israelite proverbial wisdom, we know that you can bring a sacrifice, but if your heart's not in it, if you're in fact doing it out of, that you have to, you hand the flowers and say, here you are, you old battle axe. I hope you have a good Valentine's Day. That's just not going to work, right? So the question is Abel and Cain themselves right with Yahweh? I think we naturally should go to the text looking for that question. Fair enough, Mike?
I think that's fair. I guess one question.
With me so far on that one?
One question I did have is, could it be possible that this was just a spontaneous free will offering?
Absolutely, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because it is kind of interesting. I mean, the text is trying to pack in a lot, right? So it doesn't give us a background, right. Doesn't tell us if this has been a regular practice, if this was just something that, one of them had the idea of doing. Like maybe it was Abel's idea, and I could almost imagine Cain sort of like, okay, I guess I'll do something too. Like Abel might have been the one.
Again, we don't know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we don't have that context. We're just left with simply, they do an offering, and for some reason, God looks on favor with Abel versus Cain.
Mm-hmm. What is interesting is that, after 4:26 or so, the end of our chapter, Cain and Abel are hardly ever mentioned again in the rest of the Bible. So it's not like this story is picked up by later writers. Where I would like to go is to the New Testament quick. And again, is it fair to go to the end of the story and, retroactively shove things back into the beginning of the story? In principle, no. But when you have something like Cain and Abel's story that is so quiet in the rest of the Bible, I think it's at least interesting to look ahead and ask, how are these two men handled in the later record? And here's what we find in Matthew 23:35, and the parallel is Luke 11:51. Jesus says, Jesus is talking, and on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth from the blood of, and he puts the word righteous, dikaios, in front of the word Abel. From the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, A to Z. The story of Jesus, in other words, when he's thinking about martyrdom of righteous people, he starts with Abel, interestingly. Not that he had a lot of choices, but he does put the word righteous in front of his name. So in Jesus' opinion, Abel is a dikaios, righteous person. Hebrews 11:4 mentions both Cain and Abel. And of course, the Hall of Faith, you have the question of a person doing things out of loyalty or not. That's faith in the New Testament. By faith, Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain. Now, even notice there, by loyalty, he did it. I think the emphasis there is not on the sacrifice as much as the loyalty through which he did it, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and through it being dead, he still speaks. What's more thus though important, and that's about it for Abel. Abel's story is quietly, overlooked the rest of the Bible. But when it comes to Cain, and again, we have to go to the end of the New Testament for this, so I'm being careful that we don't want to pack too much backwards, but to me, it's fascinating that when you come to Cain's reputation in the New Testament, you get two passages. 1 John 3:12, not as Cain, 3:11, for this is the message that you heard from the beginning, that we should love one another, not as Cain, but notice this next line, who was of the wicked one and murdered his brother. So when it comes to family lines or connectedness to the divine world, the writer of 1 John is confident enough to say that Cain was connected to the evil one. Now, the text of Genesis 4 doesn't say that, but if that's true, that answers a big question for me as to why God rejected Cain's offering. The last reference of Cain is in Jude 11. Woe to them. Remember, the story of Jude is fun because of the book of Jude. He never gets to his main point, right? Beloved, I was diligent to write to you about the gospel, verse 3, but I need to tell you about some other stuff. And he never gets back to the point. But he comes to 11. He's talking about, woe to those people who are rebellious in the congregation where Jude was talking to. Woe to them, for they have gone in, quote, and notice the three names he brings up. The way of Cain, they have run greedily in the error of Balaam, and perished in the rebellion of Korah. So Cain, Balaam, and Korah, two of those three we know, Balaam and Korah, seem to be non-Yahwists, especially Balaam. He's a God broker, in Numbers chapter 20. And so if it's fair to say that the writer Judas, the half-brother of Jesus, is identifying Cain with Balaam and Korah as being outside the family, right? They are, beware the way of Cain. Can I take that and with any confidence go back into this story and say, here's the problem. Cain and Abel did not, it wasn't in their offering. It was in their who they were and even who they were worshiping. And if I do that, would that make sense? And for me, again, I'll do this gently for our audience, but I find the way to handle this story is you got two guys within this righteous family, Adam and Eve, from what we can tell, are still Yahweh worshipers. But here comes the first, I would even call it the first test, because at least before in chapter 3, we had the snake doing the testing. But let's get back to the text, verse 5. So Cain was very angry, his face fell, and the Lord said to Cain, here comes the first test of the Bible, if you want to call it that, because the first one was more of a deception. Here is God talking to a gentleman, and he says this, why are you angry? Why is your face fallen? If you do well, there's the test. So what are you going to do? And we have now a question or posed to Cain, an either or question. What are you going to do about this? Will you not be accepted? If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. The Akkadian word for demon is crouching there, rabats. That's also, and I read this in a couple places, that there probably is some kind of a play on words here, because the Akkadian word for a desert demon is a rabats. And so maybe this picture of a demon crouching, lurking, waiting to jump on you is there. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. So whatever those words mean to Cain, he is given this choice, and however he is to turn around or repent, or not just of the sin of the offering, but again, to me, it's as big as, to whom do you give your worship, Cain? Who are you following here? And that's where I think that's going. So any thoughts on that?
No, I think that's pretty, it's pretty there. I mean, it is interesting that, because even the way that the text says it isn't that in verse 4, it doesn't say that God condemned Cain's offering, or I mean, I should say verse 5. It doesn't say that he condemned it. He just did not look at Cain's offering in the same way that he looked at Abel's, right? It's almost neutral, if anything. And so the reaction that Cain had to the fact that his offering was treated neutrally does seem overblown.
Yeah.
Right.
I think this answers, by the way, for me, the Samuel 15 thing, where God rejects Saul's offering. Samuel does. And then the next thing you hear is that Samuel and God have completely rejected the entire kingdom of Saul.
Yeah.
And then the next thing you hear, he's saying your sin is like the sin of witchcraft. And the reader, usually, and when I grew up with it, was you're kind of nonplussed, like, what in the world? Why in the world would God get so mad about Saul presenting an offering when other non-priests do it in the Bible? I mean, you're going to have David do it. You're going to have Solomon do it. There's going to be kings within the nation that offer sacrifices. So that doesn't seem to be the issue. So my question, or my answer for myself again there, is that Saul is doing a sacrifice in 1 Samuel 13 that's not even to Yahweh. There must be something going on here that Samuel caught, that God caught, and God's basically saying, this is witchcraft. What you're up to is just no good completely. So I don't want to get off topic, but that seems to be maybe a similar story. Let's get back to the story, because we got plenty to do.
Okay.
I'm sorry, did I want to comment there?
Well, I was just kind of curious, because one of the things I always have remembered about Saul, and I noticed this from a long time ago, was that every time he referred to Yahweh, or he referred to God, where he's talking with Samuel, especially in that incident of him being caught doing the sacrifice, that his response is always, whenever he talks about Yahweh, he would say, the Lord your God. And I always thought that was weird, because isn't he also your God too, Saul? Like, you're technically an Israelite. So God, like Yahweh is your God too, correct? Well, so why are you using such a very clear pronoun to indicate, like, going almost out of your way to say Yahweh isn't actually my God?
Yeah. And this is a shameless plug, but my Daily Dose of Bible series that's in the Miklot, I forget where you can get this. I go through that pretty carefully in the Samuel narrative, always looking for the bigger story, right? And the which God does Saul worship question, I think, is right face front when you start looking at his speeches and how Samuel handles him, and then compare it to David, who would never say the Yahweh your God. It's always Yahweh my God to him. So yeah, fascinating distinction there, and I think it answers the question of why Saul was rejected as the first king of Israel. Yeah. All right, 4:8. Cain spoke to his brother Abel, his brother. The Midrashim and the Aramaic translations of the Hebrew, I'm forgetting what they're called.
The Targums?
Often, the Targums, they have a conversation going on here between them. Like, let's go out in the field. Let's go have a talk. So you can tell he's trying to tempt him to come out into the field. Where is verse 8? Yeah. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother and killed him. And the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel, your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? The attitude of rebellion, clearly. The Lord said, what have you done? And again, this symbolism, like that sin crouching at the door, we return to that very stark symbolism. The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground, and now you are cursed from the ground. This is the first human who's cursed in the story, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Again, we don't have a lot here. is this symbolizing or telling us that we have a repentant Cain? May I recommend again to the story that the forgiveness of sins is not the issue we're looking for in a divine counsel worldview. We're looking for which deity do you worship? And if his worship doesn't change direction, it doesn't matter if Yahweh, quote unquote, forgives him or changes his mind about him, because it's not the issue, right, that's keeping Cain away from Yahweh. Behold, you have driven me, he continues in 4:14, today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. Again, evidence that humans are populating the world at large at this point. And the Lord said to him, not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken upon him sevenfold. And the Lord put a mark on Cain. We don't know what it was. Tradition has him have, like a horn or something like that, but we have no idea. The Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. Evidence again that this story is now being put on paper for us, or papyrus. But it was a story that the world knew. And, this is repeating a story that had gone through orally many, many tribes and nations for many years. Cain went away from the presence of the Lord. I know that usually has the sense of, physically, like in 3:8, the presence of the Lord was in the garden, and Adam and Eve hid from the presence of the Lord. So maybe there was some kind of a theophany that was there. We don't know. But we also have evidence that presence of the Lord or face of the Lord can be very symbolic for just, some other examples. Did I mark them down? Beyond our scope here, but we have the presence of the Lord, like in 6:11, which would not be, the earth was corrupt before the face of God. So even there, maybe it's not necessarily having a theophany. 7:1, the Lord said to Noah, come into the ark, you and all your household. Behold, I have seen that you are righteous before my face in this generation. So that before the presence of the Lord, or before the face of the Lord, may be more symbolic than we need to make it here. But he settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Again, that really points to a very historical rendition of this story, and at least in the storyteller's mind. And in the audience mind, this is an actual physical story taking place in a physical land. Mm-hmm. So he moves to Nod, which evidences again that people are living out here. It's east of Eden. I'm ready to keep moving through our text. Cain knew his wife, again, and they have a child. And among the children, she has a child by the name of Enoch. You're going to see similar names, by the way, between Cain's line and Seth's line to come. And the names, whether that's purposeful or not in the story, I'm not sure, but the names are going to be repeating in some sense. When he built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. Naming a city after yourself, again, sounds a little prideful, but be careful. David will do the same thing when he gets Jebus. So, I've often wondered when David gets Jebus, he doesn't name it the city of Yahweh. He calls it the city of David. So be ready for people always naming it after themselves for some reason. To Enoch was born Irad. Irad fathered Mehujael. Mehujael fathered Methuselah. Methuselah fathered Lamech. So we're getting, generations down into a story, again, of probably thousands, if not millions of people. I don't know. Lamech took two wives. The name of one was Ada. The second, or another was Zilhah. I'm not even going to read. Well, you know what? Let's do it. Adab or Jabal. He was the father of those who dwell in tents. Now, that doesn't mean that if you are a tent dweller, you needed to be related to Jabal. There seems to be this, again, repeating the story for the child in the audience. This is where tent living and livestock keeping came from. They were a tribe known for that, maybe something like that. His brother's name is Jubal. He was the father of all those who play the lyre. Again, the word kol in Hebrew, translated often as all, can have a meaning of many of that kind or something like that. So that when we had back in Genesis 3 that Eve was mother of all, kol, the living, it doesn't have to mean all living people came from Eve, because in 421, all is used for not everyone again. So let's not be thrown off by the word all as being in English, a requirement of all. I guess I hate to say it that way, but
All doesn't necessarily mean everyone.
Yeah, right. Is it Luke 3, all Judea came to John the Baptist in the Jordan River. Well, that's not possible. So the all there can just mean many at times. All I want to say about this as far as Genesis 4, and I think this is all that it's trying to give us, is that we have the beginning of civilization, if not, how not just the beginning of civilization, but civilization is welcoming the family of Adam and Eve into it, something like that. So, and they're not dumb people. These aren't Neanderthals. 422, Zilhabor Tubal-Cain. He was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. I've never smelted iron, and I don't think I could. I don't have the intelligence for that kind of thing. And yet, by this point in world history, we are that far along. So I think we're trying to, in the story, make sense of where certain tribes are known for doing certain things, but we're also catching the sense that these are very advanced civilizations in comparison to what we often think of early man. Lamech, and you got this quick story of Lamech. No one really knows exactly what to do with it. Lamech said to his wives, "Hear my voice, you wives of Lamech. Listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me," obviously showing that murder is not an unknown vice at this point in world history. "A young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, Lamech's is 77. So the story of Cain is still known 7 or 8 generations in, famous, even as an oral story among the tribes at this point. So evil is still here, right? Does this teach or at least promote an idea of depravity within the human race? It doesn't teach it, I'd say, but it certainly allows for it, that we have sin being very real. Now, the question that I think the text is angling for, and that's where I want to go with this as we close chapter 4, is the end of, the last 2 verses of 4 to me are really the point of what we've just read. Adam knew his wife again, among the many children Adam and Eve have. And again, let's pick them up. They seem to be, again, Yahweh worshipers, my guess would be. And they are outside the garden now, living in the world. She bore a son, called his name Seth, for she said, God has appointed, and that word sounds like Seth in Hebrew, for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. So as a replacement for Abel, she gets and calls this boy Seth. And notice where the story ends before we get to a generational kind of a break. To Seth also a son was born, and he named him Enosh. So now this is the grandson of Adam and Eve. At that time, this is the first use in Hebrew of the little word. I'm going to run over to it here on the right side of the text if you're looking. Oz, then. It's the first use of the little particle, oz, in Hebrew, which means then, and it's properly translated both in the ESV and the New King James, as I have there, as then. The next time it's used is 12:6. I'm going to run up to it. Abraham passed through the land in the place of Shechem as far as the terebinth tree of Moab, and the Canaanites were then in the land. Okay, that's 12:6. 13:7. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The Canaanites and the Perizzites then, Oz, dwelt in the land. The point being, and it's used again in 39:5 for Joseph. The point being that the little particle Oz is important to a storyline when he's trying to make a time marker. It's not incidental. So I would recommend that we take it that way. So let's do it again. 26. To Seth was born a son, called him Enosh. At that time, or then, people began to call upon the name of Yahweh. I take that as a major moment in the story, in the sense that why would you write that without implying to the reader that before this time, people were not calling upon the name of the Lord? There seems to be a notable move for Enosh and his generation, it took a grandson of Adam and Eve in order to get Yahweh worship back in vogue. So where did it go? Here's my theory. I'll throw it out to you, Mike. That Abel, in the words of Matthew 23 and Jesus' opinion, which I'm going to give a lot of credence to, Abel was righteous. And Adam and Eve had these two boys, and one was righteous and the other worshiped the evil one. We don't have a name for that yet, based on 1 John 3:12. And these two boys then went different directions. Well, the problem was one died. So you don't even have a line of Abel. He never had children. And so Cain's line becomes the focus of Genesis 4, ending with this Lamech fella who seems to be brazen in his admittance that he had killed someone, right? However, that's, why it's there, we're not sure. But the point seems to at least give us this sense that the line of Cain, as it went into the world, became part of the world and even brazen in their relationship to Yahweh, something like that. So that by the time you come to 426, the end of chapter 4, and you're about to start, or restart the genealogy stuff, that the reader would be wondering, I wonder whatever happened to righteous Abel. How did that story play out? Because if Cain went into the world and became a non-Yahwist, and his family became non-Yahwists, then I wonder, how do we ever get it back? And the little answer there, or the little quip at the end of 4 is therefore very important, because the writer is saying, you know where Yahwism comes from? It comes from the grandson of Adam and Eve named Enosh, who was born to the replacement for Abel, that is Seth. That call upon the name of the Lord will be a line used, and I don't think I need to remind the audience of this, but when it comes to Genesis 12, and I think this is the next, you know what it is? Yeah, Genesis 12:8. When Abraham's called out of Ur, and he is given a great promise, which we'll get to. He moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, pitched his tent at Bethel on the west, Ai on the east. He built an altar to Yahweh, and there's the line, called on the name of Yahweh. That's the second occurrence of that phrase after 426. Excuse me. So if the story of, again, as I've recommended, watch not where the first occurrence of something happens, but the second occurrence, right? Second and third seem to be often more important than the first. And the second and the third happen in the life of Abraham, when he, as the consummate Yahwist, moves out of Babylon, stops worshiping Marduk, and switches his worship to Yahweh. 13:4, there Abram called on the name of Yahweh. So whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord, Romans 10:9 and 10, I think are picked up by Paul later to be, as the traditional salvation verse. Paul's doing a midrash on that idea that, guys, we haven't changed the story. The story will be, and let me make my summation point here, Mike, and you can respond as you'd like. This, as I summarized Genesis 4 in my head, I have a righteous pair, Adam and Eve, having made a mistake. They were tricked, they were duped, whatever you want to call it. God ordered them to never eat of the tree of life again, thus they will die. So their natural carbon-based existence as they enter into the rest of the world is going to go the way of the world, and that is you're simply going to tip over and stop breathing. That is problem number one, that we are, as the reader, wondering, will God ever take that away? Are we ever going to reverse the issue of death? Because that would obviously be on the mind of the reader coming out of 3. Well, we're not told anything about that in 4, but what we do get in 4 is another problem, and that is we have a family line coming out of Adam and Eve, one that goes a wrong way. They worship, apparently, they don't worship Yahweh, because the end of 4 says Enosh did worship Yahweh. So I'm taking the positive of 426 and applying the negative backward throughout the text of Genesis 4. So 2 problems so far in our story. We're all going to die, and we can, based on 4, have a choice of worshiping Yahweh or not. And that's going to be, again, should we call it a problem, but let's watch for that storyline to develop moving forward. That to me is where a divine counsel worldview, I personally, for me, Mike, and I'll throw it to you, but does a divine counsel worldview necessitate a view of salvation that is a question of which Elohim are you worshiping? To me, it does, because that brings the story of rebellious spirits right down to the level of what is salvation. It's worshiping the right one among the many alternatives that are out there, including the devil himself. So that's why I think it's important for me and for a divine counsel worldview to unpack the text like this, instead of saying, yeah, we're all sinners, we need to be forgiven. Well, again, that, as true as that might be, is that salvation? I would say that's never going to be presented that way in the story. So, well, what do you think? Any thoughts and responses we close up for?
So I think, like what you mentioned, right, about the typical way we usually describe it, we're all sinners, we're all in need of grace, or we're all in need of God. It's a distillation of essentially, like, there's a lot of presumptions that fill in that concept of, like, we're all just sinners, right? And in some sense, it's only when we start teasing it out that we get into the specifics of, like, well, when we say we're all sinners, ultimately, like, our sin is showing that we're not loyal to Yahweh. But that's the problem, though, is that when we distill it down to that, we're not getting to really the core thought of, like, well, why does one sin? Why does one rebel? It's because if you're rebelling, you're not loyal to a particular person. And in this case, it's regarding Yahweh. I mean, two additional thoughts I had. I was looking up the Targum version of this passage. And it's interesting. The Targums obviously are translations of the Hebrew from way later into Aramaic. And so there's a bit of, like, almost like a paraphrase commentary running at the same time.
They love to comment as they go.
Yeah.
You're right.
And which is helpful, because it gives us, like, a sense of what was the mindset of the time when this translation was made. What were they just presuming or assuming that was just in the text, or just unspoken? And so one of the parts that they bring up is when God actually questions Cain, and he's then describing about the blood of Cain. He says, the voice of, this is in verse 10, the voice of the blood of the righteous multitudes that were to arise from Abel, your brother, is crying against you before me from the earth. And so, like, that concept that you were just talking,
blood is more like a corporate idea.
That it's like
of other people as well.
And I liked how, like, in the Targum, it goes into that were to arise, meaning essentially you killed off a line of people, it essentially, to what you were saying, like, that until you get to the birth of Seth, we then only have one branch of the family line, and that family line is non-Yahwist. They're not worshiping Yahweh. They're not loyal to Yahweh. And so the Targum here seems to be kind of supporting that concept that the slaughter of Abel killed not just Abel, but essentially all of the possible descendants that were supposed to come from Abel. And so that they collectively with Abel as well is saying, this is not right. Like, this should not have happened.
Yeah. And it fits Matthew 23, where Jesus, complains that from the blood of righteous Abel to Zechariah, you collectively have been killing off righteous people.
Yeah. And so that's why I thought that was an interesting idea when I looked at the Targum version. And the other idea that I had was, I always thought it was really interesting, right? Cain essentially complains, or he grieves over the fact that he's been caught and that his punishment was so hard for him to bear. And almost it seemed like it was out of God's mercy given to Cain of, like, no, I'm not going to allow someone to kill you, not going to allow someone to take revenge on you. There's going to be a mark on you, in some sense, a sign of protection. And 5 generations or so later, the descendant of Cain takes what is supposed to be a protection, like a kind mercy, despite the fact that he had committed a crime, that his sister had committed a crime. Lamech then takes that as though, well, if Cain gets avenged 7 times, then I ought to get avenged 77 times, as though like I'm a bigger deal, and sort of abuses that sign of protection. And that is just, I don't know if we want to say it's depraved, but it's definitely getting a little bit more perverse of taking for granted something. I have
no problem seeing a fall of mankind into deeper and deeper depravity. That's certainly possible. And the one thing that I'm always, curious though to say to that argument that, we're going to get worse and worse is, well, then what about civilizations that come out of it? And, in some sense, our civilization today, we don't have slavery, and that's good. In other words, can civilizations make good moves morally? I'd say sure. So, but that's a separate subject. But that's a good point. Thank you, Mike. And it also brings up that God, Yahweh, can be very gracious to someone who's not a Yahwist, right? Yeah. And I think that'll be a very a powerful story coming out of Genesis, where God chooses Isaac and refuses Ishmael, but he will give a prediction about Ishmael's future in such a way that he is going to be a great man. He's going to be the leader of many people, a prince among the nations and things like that. So the idea that God runs the world, runs the cosmos, is never lost on the biblical writer, even though, as we'll see, God does give created spirits authoritative rule over the earth. That's coming in Genesis 10 and 11. But Yahweh still runs the show, and that's always behind it. So even when it comes to giving mercy to someone like a Cain or even a Lamech, I suppose, God always has that right. Mm-hmm. Are we ready for 5? Anything else we're leaving out? 4 is a story of Cain, basically. And because Abel's killed too quick. So it would have been nice to see what Abel's line does, but we kind of lose the Yahwist line for a while, and we get it back at the end of 4. So now when we start next time, we'll do 5, and beware of genealogies, that you get too tired of them or get bored. But to them, it was more of a, watch the line of a group that, as we'll see, worship Yahweh. So I'm willing to call it a day if you are.
I think that's good enough thoughts for today. So thank you, everyone, for listening to Genesis 4 with us.
And we'll talk to you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.